Hi, my name is Brandon, and I'd like to welcome you to the Crucible of Thought podcast. I'm here to share things that interest me and things that I think the Lord has brought to my attention. This is episode 108. Today, I'm very pleased to bring to you an interview with Dr. Miche van Essen of Transmission Ministry. I learned about her through Zach Lambert after my interview with him in a previous episode of this podcast, and after watching some of her content on Instagram and other social media, was very interested in speaking with her. She graciously agreed, and we had a wonderful conversation for about an hour. I could easily have continued on as I had so many more questions than time would permit, and I hope you'll find the conversation just as stimulating as I found it to be. We covered a range of topics from ethnic identity and assumptions to queer theology and intersectional theology, and it was deeply enlightening. I have to say at the beginning that if you'd told me a few years ago that I'd ever say those words, I'd have said you would be crazy, as I thought they were all in deep error and very dangerous to a Christian. But as I've heard about these matters from people who actually live and breathe in these spaces and spend a lot of time thinking about them, I've learned that they're not what I thought. There's no reason to be scared of them. And in fact, there's great value in considering what they have to offer us. In short, I think that opening our minds to what others with vastly different life stories and lived experiences have to share will open our hearts and our spirits to aspects of God that we've walled off and rejected for far too long. So I hope that if these topics make you uncomfortable, you'll sit quietly with them for a bit and see what the Lord might say to you. And if you are already comfortable in these spaces, tilt your ear to the Holy Spirit to see what new things you might learn. So, without further ado, here's my talk with Dr. Miche van Essen. Well, hi, Dr. Miche van Essen, correct?
That's right. That's my name. Miche like quiche.
What do you prefer that I call you, Miche or Dr. van Essen?
Miche is just fine.
Okay, so good. I'm so happy to talk to you tonight. I've learned a little bit about you in the last month or so and was fascinated by what I heard and what I watched online, and I'm really enjoying your material and looking forward to talking to you tonight. So
Yeah,
one of the things I think
great.
I want to start with is just asking you, is queer an okay term for this conversation and for you? And if not, what's your thought on that?
It is for me. I use queer because I'm also pansexual and not only transgender. So queer fits really well for me, but we're not a monolith. So I know that there's enough folks that don't like queer at all. Um, I'm okay when other people call me queer. I also know people that are okay with using the term queer but don't want other people to use the term queer. So,
Okay.
I guess what I'm saying, we're not a monolith.
And are
Yes.
your preferred pronouns, what are they?
She, her.
Okay. And mine, of course,
Yes.
him, his. Well, not of course, but mine. So to start off with, I readily acknowledge my recent participation in this space. I came out as affirming on October 22,
Mm.
2022 on National Coming Out Day. And I've had a lot of contact with people in the queer space, but it's been somewhat limited in ways. I've been participating in Matt Nightingale's queer spiritual contemplative group, or actually the affirming side of that, for about a year now and really
All
thoroughly enjoying it.
right.
Uh,
Nice.
and I've had a lot of contact, but I know that I have a lot to learn from people such as yourself. So I'm going to be as humble as I can. And one of the things I'm hoping here is to learn from you. And I look forward to growing from the conversation. So why don't you introduce yourself real quick and give a little bit of your background? I'm sure people can go find out more, but what are the things you think are most important?
Yeah, sure. My name, as we all heard, Dr. Miche van Essen. I am a senior partner at the Resonance, which is a consulting firm, management consulting firm, where I mostly focus on leadership development, church consulting, seminary reform, uh, and just, giving workshops and talks around the country about how to create safer faith spaces. I also am the director of operations for Transmission Ministry Collective, which is an online ministry that's serving over 500 trans people.
Wow.
Um, it's almost like a church, but it's a mixture of people who really love Jesus, and that's their common denominator. But there's also a bunch of people who have been hurt by the church, and that's their common denominator. So that's sometimes sad. Yeah, no, I'm happily married. I have a wife. I have two kids. I live in Richmond, Virginia.
Oh,
I'm
not too
pretty.
far from me. I'm in Southern
Yeah.
Maryland,
Oh, let's go.
about 2 hours
That's
away.
close by. Yep, yep, yep,
Uh,
yep.
so, how long have you been doing the church consulting ministry?
It's an evolution. When I moved to the States in 2012, I was a teacher by trade, but my credentials didn't transfer. So I started, in the beginning, you're not allowed to do paid work in America during your immigration process. So I just fixed people's tax things. And before I knew it, I started my own company and started making websites. That evolved into UX design, that evolved into management consulting. So it is 12 years old, but to say that it's been 12 years old is also not completely true. I'm mostly focused on church consulting the last 3 years. Yeah.
Okay. That sounds interestingly similar to my non-professional background. I did for I don't know. I started in 1995, and I ran a small business where I developed software for churches. So doing user interface design all on my own for this
Mm,
basically projection software from back when it was not a normal thing to do digital computers on the wall. I was
yeah,
one of
yeah,
the
yeah.
pioneers in that area, although other people did much better with it than I have. But so I've done a lot and I'm building my own websites for it. I ran our church's website for 20 years, things like that. So
Yeah, that's
that's
cool.
cool. So where did you move here from?
I moved from the Netherlands. I was born in,
Okay.
some people call it Holland, but that's technically incorrect.
I've actually been to Holland. I spent a week there in 2004 on a business trip. Got to visit Amsterdam, spent a week in about an hour north of Amsterdam, and I loved it. It was a fascinating place.
Yes.
So
Yes, yes.
is your heritage also from the Netherlands? You have dark hair, which is, I think, not a Slavic trait, right?
I think I don't know what are Dutch people Germanic? Yeah, they're probably Germanic, but I am Indonesian. So
Indonesian.
my father may be white, Italian descent, but very far away. So he's just a
Okay.
Dutch guy. My mother is from Indonesia, and if we trace it deeper, it's Papua New Guinea. But yeah, yeah.
So your accent's fascinating. Was your mother speaking Indonesian around the house?
No, no.
Okay.
My accent like this is because I think what happens when you're when English is not your first language, and I moved here in 2012, uh, and I was 30 at that point. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was 30 in 2012. So, so I think in the Netherlands they teach you British English, and then when
Ah,
I moved to America, my wife and her family, some people say they have a southern accent. I think it's a normal accent because that's the first interaction that I had. So anyway, this is the result of that. Like me being yes, this is like a culturally confused
fascinating. I love it.
mixed with
So
everything.
in a few of your videos, you talk about assumptions that people make about your heritage, and it's understandable why, I think, because you're fairly white presenting. But I guess this kind of falls into the same realm as just because a person parks in the handicap spot and walks away from the car doesn't mean they're not truly handicapped. My has some significant physical limitations, and she could probably
Mm,
qualify for handicap tags, but she's posted those things on her website from time to time. So
yeah.
obviously, we need to stop assuming we can see everything we need to know about a person. And oh, by the way, obviously, I think that includes gender and sex,
Yeah.
something we're
Yeah.
starting to learn these days. But at any rate, I think some people who look at a person that what they think of as white, seeing them without looking too closely, and then seeing light skin and a certain eye shape and face shape, and they figure that's the end of it. They're just simply white. And I think this is privileging whiteness as I'm learning.
Yeah.
And I used to fit
Yeah.
in that camp.
Absolutely.
And I'd wonder why it was such a big deal to claim non-whiteness, to truly claim one's ethnicity. I think in America we're kind of raised with this idea of, well, it's one nation. Why aren't we just acting like one nation? So it seemed wrong to me as a conservative, but I no longer feel that way. But I know how hard it was for me to overcome that. And So I'm sensitive to how other people feel. I'm curious if you could talk about that kind of their journey of being race affirming might be a way to talk about it.
Yeah, yeah, sure thing. It's a complex topic, right? Other Indonesians typically can see it, especially Indonesians in the Netherlands, because if you really want to go technical, I'm Indo, and Indo is the classification of people who are half Indonesian, and we have a complete. It's a fascinating Google rabbit hole that I encourage everybody to go on. But half Indonesians are a very specific group of people that have multiple layers of complexity to them.
Okay.
But that being said, my family is all colors. You know, some of my aunts are very dark. Some of my cousins are even lighter than me. So so even though other people can see that I'm Indonesian, maybe some with my cousin cannot. But the problem is a mental model problem. This is what I love to talk about a lot in my teaching, because when we close our eyes and we say imagine an Asian person, we typically see an East Asian person, and that's the problem right away. So, and in America, there's East Asian people that are trying to prove that they're American, because people go to them, it's like, where are you from? I'm from America. No, 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 where are you from? Right? You get that awkward conversation, which has racist undertones. And then you have the opposite side of like me having to prove to people that I'm Asian. Well, I don't feel like I have to prove anything to anybody because I'm just Miche. So that's just the way it is. But it is a problematic assumption that not only do we have a preconceived notion of what an Asian person looks like, but on top of that, when being corrected, it's hard to accept that correction, that discomfort that we may feel. It's like, like I don't know if I would say that I pass as white. I could pass as white, and I have done that in the past. Absolutely, that was a different life when I had a 1 foot beard, etc., etc. But yes, yeah, it is a complex topic, but
I,
my
I married
Asian heritage is very important.
my wife's mother was from Puerto Rico and her father, I think, as well. And so I married a Hispanic wife, and my kids have that beautiful transracial complexity, and I think they
Yes.
love it. I think they play off on it. And
Yes, they
my wife has
should.
often said that she could kind of pass for a lot of different cultures because of the particular way her features, and she
Yeah,
loves that, I think, herself. Um, I think we'd all be better off if we embraced complexity a little more. Um,
absolutely.
I didn't I didn't mention this to you before, but one of the things that my spiritual father talks about is uh, there's a verse in the Bible that talks about a vision of a man of uh, many colors rising out of the sea. I think it's in Daniel. And the interesting thing, a man with a body of beryl is what it actually says. And the interesting thing about the jewel beryl is that it has like six different colors. There's emerald,
Mm,
which is the most famous, but there's also like a cyan colored, there's a pink, there's a colorless, there's a yellow. And so the prophet sees this image of what I think can properly be interpreted as the kingdom of God in its wholeness, the body of Christ coming together in
mm.
diversity and beauty together, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I
So,
like that. I like that. I'll take
uh,
that.
so along these lines, let's talk about like identity self-reporting because I think this plays into what you've experienced, which is
Yeah.
you have a certain set of things about yourself that you claim, and as in your case, not just your ethnicity, but it's also sexuality and gender. And
Yes.
for me, as a recovering conservative, if we shall call it that, one of the hardest things to get over, I guess, has been this false idea that we are just what we look like, and it's that
Yeah.
simple. There's no need to talk about what doesn't look obvious. Anything else is silliness in that view. And so that used to lead me to disregard what someone looks like or what someone says they are, rather. And of course, in that realm, it's a perfect argument against homosexuality or transness because the claim is, oh, they're disregarding the truth and living according to how they feel, but feelings lie. And I really do think I know better now intellectually, But I wonder how former evangelicals, we former anti-affirming people, can do better. How we can invite more people into being more affirming, despite decades of practice not doing that. So,
Yeah, yeah. Such a good question because it's again that mental model. You'll hear me say mental models a lot. It's one of my
yeah.
main fields in my study. It's that idea that we have been almost programmed to think a certain way,
Hmm.
right? I remember a while ago, this woman, a supermodel, started her own company in programming,
Okay.
and the internet went wild. It was like, oh yeah, you just use your money to hire people, and then she showed that she actually could code very well, right? And like, why would you assume that I can't know what that I don't know any programming language? Because the assumption is you're a woman
Hmm.
and a supermodel at that. So therefore you can probably not do any programming languages. So it's that preconceived notion, that mental model that's in us that we're like, oh no, this is what we believe. And it's very hard to get out of that mode for anybody. I had conversations with fellow queer people that still have an initial yuck response when they see queer intimate scenes on TV. While we are queer, right? I'm still talking to people that still is perpetuated in their bodies. They embody that feeling of some people call that disgust theology. My
Yeah.
friend Billy is very, very much into that, and it's fascinating to see how we embody that, even when we're already way past it. So
I
I
had a
think we got to be
wonderful
kind to
chance to meet with Billy
ourselves.
about. I'm sorry. I had a
No,
wonderful
no
chance
worries.
to meet with Billy about a year ago when she came down to our area to see the giant rubber ducky. I don't know if you saw the news about that. And so I got to spend a few hours with her talking to her and really the discuss theology
Yeah,
presentation and also the contamination work that
yeah.
she and her brother have done has been fascinating to me.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing. And that's exactly it. There is a part that is really hard to get out, that we got to be kind to ourselves and understand, okay, we have been programmed to think a certain way and it will take a long time to get over it. That being said, all the arguments against homosexuality that are scripture related are completely irrelevant,
Hmm.
right? Because you often hear people today. I am a deleter and blocker of comments. I delete hateful comments every single day. And today I got my number one favorite comment that I get almost every day. The Bible clearly says homosexuality is a sin.
Yeah.
And I always want to reply with the Bible clearly endorses slavery.
Right.
Yet we are all comfortable with saying, yes, slavery is wrong. And it's exactly the same. It took a long time for people to get over that, yeah, but the Bible clearly endorses slavery. Why should we give up slavery? Fast forward to today, there's not a single person, well, maybe a couple very outliers there, not, but in general, there's not a single person that would say slavery is good. And it's
Yeah.
the same, right? So even if we could have exegetical conversations about what the Bible says or not says, ultimately it's completely irrelevant because we exist. I am here, right? I am a trans woman and I identify as such. If somebody says that's not a thing, well, I'm still going to be here whether a person believes it or not. So now it's up to that person to be nasty about it or not.
Yeah.
Now it's not my problem anymore. So ultimately, I really feel it's those two things, that pre-programmed way of thinking about people, and on the other hand, like, hey, maybe we need to start transcending what we believe is true and start assuming that that's not, and listening to people's stories, right?
I There's a subconscious element that takes us a long time to work out. When I spent a couple hours with a different trans person, I really was trying first. It was my first in-depth meeting with a trans person. That's not quite true. I actually had been assigned a trans person as a mentee uh, probably a decade ago, and I at the time was too conservative to even feel comfortable with it, and I messed that. I treated the person badly, so I was determined this time I'm going to learn, I'm going to grow, I'm going to do the right thing here.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
unfortunately, despite all of that, I still misgendered this person twice, and I felt horrible about it. The problem was that I think as I thought about it really hard, uh, they are feminine presenting in appearance, but a lot of the cues I was getting were the old masculine learned things that I think are built into a lot of people by their upbringing. And
Yeah.
it confused
Yeah.
me enough that I just could not catch myself in time a couple times. Um,
Yeah.
how can we learn to do better? Is there anything that we can really do to not fall on that trap? I mean, this person was very gracious to me and far
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
gracious than I deserved. But I guess it's not unusual, so they've probably had that happen a few times. But what can we
Yeah.
do to grow?
Yeah, we definitely have that happen every now and then. Well, more than every now and then. There's two responses that I typically have for it. One is a very practical. We have to practice.
Okay.
So, and we have to practice specifically in our home situation. So, what I like to say, I literally just had a conversation about this last Sunday with a friend who had a similar question. Like the only way that we can learn to not misgender people is to tell all our friends that we're close with, all our acquaintances that we're close with, or our online contacts that we talk with a lot, I want to be called out whenever I misgender somebody.
Okay.
And then specifically whenever we talk about a certain person to try to constantly have that accountability. And in case of doubts, lean towards they. I am not insulted by they them. I am insulted by he him. And I'm typically less gracious than most trans people. But yeah, yeah, it's a long journey for a lot of people, and I understand where people are coming from. But that first part is the practicing at home, because the only way we can do it. Oof, I work with so many trans people, right? If I want to make sure that I don't get it wrong, I put post-its on my screen above their faces. I will do
Okay.
whatever it takes to not make them feel unseen. And that's on me, right? So it's not that person's
Hmm.
job, obviously. But we all do it. I misgender people and I feel terrible about it. And I'm a leader in a trans community, right? So we gotta be we gotta be kind to ourselves, but not too kind. And
Okay.
then the other thing that I like to say about this is that this is more like a realization thing, is that a lot of the cues that we think are male and female cues are learned. So for example, a a child does not know their gender before they're 3.
Okay.
Yet boys before they're 3, who are living in a specific environment that they have specific male and female role models, and not like gender fluid role models, will drop their voices before they're 3. They
Really?
will want to sound more masculine
Huh.
because of that pre-programming mechanism that they see and adopt. So those are cues that are not actually true. Or, for example, if you have ever talked with a woman and you've noticed that that woman says a lot, that's not because that woman is not well spoken, but it's because when women talk and they leave a moment of silence, a man tends to jump in immediately. So if they don't say they're gonna get talked over. So they say a lot. And now fast forward, there's so many women that say because of that. And the same with the higher pitches that you hear women uses and the intonation. When I went to vocal coaching, the amount of things, these small things that I found out that women do, and my vocal coach asked me, do you want that or do you not want that? It was an eye-opening experience to see. So I think those two things, like really realizing that a lot of these cues are not necessarily male or female. They're because the society kind of sucks in that way. And in the other way, there's very practical ways to practice this, especially if you have a person that you're gonna see more often than once.
Yeah, I have a family member who lives in my house, one of my children, that is chosen a different name than we gave them. And
Yeah,
just the first name, they prefer a different first name. And so
yeah,
they've basically all of their friends call them this new name. And,
yeah,
this was after 20 years of growing up. And so we've had to, and that's not a gender change, that's just a preferred name change, but it's
yeah,
still, you catch yourself doing that. Just, it's like, again, and I'm not trying to, but I see what you mean about the
yeah,
practicing. Even when we're not talking to them, we choose to use that name, the wife and I. So I think,
yeah,
yeah, I can see what you're saying. Um, and
yeah, yeah,
I like your idea of being accountable, explicitly accountable. To me, that has been part of my general deconstruction process in some ways of asking people to call me when I'm going back into those things that I learned not to do while I was in counseling. You
yeah,
know, help
yeah,
me
yeah,
not do that.
yeah.
Um, okay, thank you for that. I wanted to ask you one of my biggest eye-opening revelations when I started to reconsider my opposition to LGBTQ rights was that what I saw as the obvious story for somebody was usually far from obvious for them. And their stories typically, almost always actually, confounded my expectations, my assumptions. And I think this goes along with what we're already talking about, but how can we be more humble about other people's stories? I mean, this goes beyond just queer rights. I think this goes into,
Yeah,
oh, you're homeless. I know why you're homeless. I've been working at a homeless
exactly.
shelter. Oh, you've got this kind of a low paying job. I know why you do. Or learning to be humble. But do you think there's anything we can do, particularly in the queer community, to be more humble?
Yeah, yeah. This goes to the roots of my work as an intersectional theologian.
Okay.
And for those who are listening and have no clue what intersectionality means, it's a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal scholar, who found out that certain people receive uh, oppression, but it was very one-dimensional. So, for example, the first case that Kimberly Crenshaw used was uh, a black woman working at a car plant who wanted a raise. She wanted to work where the men were working, um, but um, but she didn't get the job, and she thought, oh, it's because of racism. But the judge disagreed. It's like, no, there are black men working in the plant, and there's women working in the plant. But the problem was that Kimberly Crenshaw saw, yes, there's black men working and white women, but
Mhm.
we're talking about a black woman who therefore has two intersectional identities. So I always like to clarify that when I use the term intersectional, I mean that kind of intersectional. I don't mean the intersection between faith and work, which is still grammatically correct, obviously. But so intersectional theology, therefore, tries to find places in both scripture, church history, and history in how we can find those oppressed voices and assume that we've misheard them. That's a great first step, right? We assume that we misheard them and try to amplify them. But there's really one big lesson that I've learned for myself, and one that I specifically constantly talk about, is once we find those oppressed voices, we have to. I never say we have to without a reason, because I think people should do whatever they want. But we have to listen to them and believe them,
Okay.
because that's the big part, right? You talk about homelessness. If that homeless person says, well, I have a story, we can just be skeptical, or we can understand that they have a unique story to tell and that we have to believe them. But we, specifically privileged people, tend to dismiss stories and don't believe in them.
I learned some of that with watching my black friends cope with George Floyd in the aftermath. And uh, I spent some time after that interviewing some black people in my church, well, people of color in general in my church for their experiences
Mm-hmm.
in the church, and discovered that there were a lot of stories that we'd never been told.
Exactly.
And the one example that really sticks out to me is the lady who stood up and told the story of getting hauled out of her car at gunpoint with her 7-year-old son. And this is the cutest, most harmless little old lady that you'd ever imagine telling this
Yeah.
story. And basically, the response of some people was, I don't believe you. And besides, the cop did the right thing. You know,
Exactly.
very
It's
hurtful.
bizarre.
Yeah. And so, learning, I think that taught me something about that choice to believe
Yeah.
someone else over my, and that's a very non-conservative thing to do, I think, where we kind of assume that we know better.
Yeah. 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 And we got to understand that that's oppression squared
Hmm.
because she was already dragged out of a car at gunpoint. It's already traumatizing.
Yeah,
But now people don't believe her.
layered on top of that.
Oppression squared. And
Yeah,
intersectionality teaches us that there's a lot of those stories, like the story of David returning the ark to Jerusalem, which is often used as a great story of how gracious David was when he danced, when he received the ark back, and he put on an ephod and he danced, and he goes back, and his wife Michal says, "You embarrassed yourself," and they never have children anymore. So go to any typical biblical commentary, and they will say David was so happy, and essentially Michal got what she deserved.
yeah,
Until we go back to that story and say, okay, let's assume that she's not being heard because she's a woman, especially in that time period. And you start seeing that whoever wrote that story also didn't try to make David look good because he took the ark and he let it be carried by oxen,
right.
even though the Torah says it should
Don't do
not
that.
be carried, it should by priests. Somebody touched it, it's died, it's on David. There was jealousy involved. Last time when a king sacrificed something without consent, it was Saul, and after that he lost his entire kingdom. Yet David sacrifices in front of the entirety of Israel, pretends to be a high priest by wearing an ephod, and is being rightfully called out by his wife. And her punishment is that she then afterwards never being seen by David anymore. And after that, we can see David's erratic behavior. It fits so well in the story, yet it's so hard for us to see because we see the story of a man and of a woman. We don't believe the woman's story, we believe the man's story.
Boy, that's a rabbit hole you could spend hours on, isn't it?
There's yes, rewriting the not writing. No, I don't want to rewrite the Bible. Rereading in the entirety of Scripture and constantly pausing when we see a marginalized identity is tiring, but is very humbling. Very humbling.
I've been getting touches of that by listening to people like Pete Enns,
Yeah. Yeah.
Pete
Oof.
Ruins whatever
Let's
book,
go.
Pete Ruins Genesis, Pete Ruins Exodus. Just
Yes,
to
he's good
rethink
at
about
that.
some of our assumptions about what the Bible supposedly says.
Yeah.
Um, I want to come back to that, but I had a couple other questions first because I really I do want to ask you a couple more questions about theology kinds of things. But
Sure.
you're fairly recently out as a trans person, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Were you late in discovering this, or did you need to hide it because, or was this just a thing that you knew that you were sitting on? Tell me a little bit about your story, because I think when
Yeah.
we're receptive to these things, we can learn a lot. So
Yeah.
I want to learn. I'd like to hear some of your story.
No, yeah, it is fairly recent that I'm out. I knew that I was different ever since I was young. The earliest story that I always tell people about this is when pardon, when I was a child and my cousin got a dress and I was not allowed to wear it
Hmm.
because I'm a boy. Well, my grandma was cool, so she let me wear it anyway, but
For awesome.
Yep. There you go. Yes, and then continuously, I think in my teenage years, I always hung out with the girls and I did my makeup. And I remember because I grew up in a foster system, so there's a lot of reports written about my behavior there. That was always like, Miche has an identity crisis, this and that. But I took it serious a couple of times. I tried coming out 3 times before, actually. And the first time, my queer friends told me, no, you should not do that. You're going to look like a man in a dress. And it was pretty painful. But then again, it was also the 90s. So there's that. And the second big coming out attempt was, I think, 12-ish years ago, right before I moved to America. I was in therapy for it. I was going through the transition, but then I paused it because I was not healthy. So I really wanted to focus on happiness and health first. I didn't want to use my transition as a crutch for happiness, which is a whole conversation in and of itself. And then finally, I came out about 3 years ago, yeah, a little over 3 years ago. And yeah, yeah, my wife knew that I had gender dysphoria, but I guess after being with me for years, we both thought it was not a thing anymore. Because in America, gender roles are very, very
Locked in.
much more amplified. Yeah, they're amplified, locked down. That's a good way of saying it. So before I knew it, like in the Netherlands, when I was still living there and when my wife met me, people thought I was all kinds of androgynous, metrosexual. Some people even called me gay, but into women, whatever people came up with, right? And I was already bisexual then. That's how I called myself. But, you know, it was a whole trip. I started going into ministry here. I became a pastor eventually. Yeah, really tried my best to be a man and fit within the norm. So I guess I was out and then I got recloseted and
Yeah.
ooh,
I haven't yet talked to someone who was out as a transsexual that did not have something that they absolutely knew was wrong from their very earliest memories. And
yeah,
that kind of, to me, breaks the argument that, oh, this is social contagion. That starts to make me a little mad.
yeah,
It's a convenient dismissal, I think, by conservatives.
yep,
But
yep,
I have yet to
absolutely.
talk to anyone at length and have anything other than, yeah, this is finally me being who I've always known.
Yeah,
Which
absolutely.
it's a completely different spin than, oh, I'm just conveniently playing around with this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I would use the term transgender over transsexual though. I think there's still people that are okay with the term, but we're moving away from saying transsexual. I guess we said that in the 90s. When were you born?
68, late 60s.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I'm
I definitely
56
also grew
years
up with
old.
the term. Got it. I also grew up with that
Transgender,
term.
I mean, it's only been in the last probably, well, for me, I'm probably late to the party, but getting to the idea that sexuality and gender are not linked together
Yeah. Yeah,
is a fairly
exactly.
recent out cultural thing in America, at least. So,
Yeah, they're trying to they're doing their best. It's been LGBTQ for so long, right? In a sense that the T had to team up with the LGB,
mhm.
uh, and then now it's being more expanded. Like there's been a lot of work done in culture. And yes, I happen to be somebody that is pansexual, right? Transcending sexuality, if you will. But yes, transgender definitely pertains to my gender. Yeah.
A couple of my online acquaintances are asexual, which for them fits into that same spectrum, the A
Yeah.
part of LGBTQIA, and they're fairly vocal about the idea that this is part of this whole same thing. You can't write us off simply because we don't, you know, we're not moving from one category to another, or we're not crossing boundary lines, disgust lines. It's Okay, and that's another example where those of us who are new to this party are kind of like, I just have to sit with that and sit with your experience and not judge it,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, exactly.
and I guess the hard part for us is to come to grips with the idea that normal is not as black and white as we really would like it to be, that it's okay for people to be, not fit
Exactly.
into a given bucket as readily as we would like.
Yeah, yeah. The value of that certain things need to be clear are not helpful.
Hmm.
So living in ambiguity, which is something we see consistently back in scripture as well, but living in ambiguity is actually a very good place to be.
Hmm.
So instead of being the expert, we live in ambiguity and we don't get into those situations because we're not the expert. We're just like, well I just don't know. Teach me or tell me more, etc., etc. So, especially because I had a conversation with a pastor who said we're very affirming and it's great and blah 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 blah. We have trans people on staff, but then they said, oh, but there's this person who just cannot make up their mind. One week they're he and the other week they're she. And then I pushed back, of course, and said, if you think that's complex, that may be somebody that's either gender fluid or it may be somebody that's actively figuring it out, but it's literally not hard. It's literally not hard. You're only making it hard by saying that it's so hard to one week call them he and the other week call them she. It's really not hard.
It's hard for, I think a large part of the pushback in some circles is because it requires us to, it's not hard, but it is because we have to be
Right.
intentional and we have to
Exactly.
choose to honor someone's understandings in a way that is not comfortable
Yeah.
for us.
Yeah, and that discomfort and ambiguity, they go hand in hand because the moment that we feel like in evangelical spaces, you often see that there's discomfort, and that's something that evangelicals are not familiar with, right? I was just having this conversation with my wife when she was asking my son, who said, "Ow!" Like, wait, did that hurt or was it uncomfortable? Why we
Mm.
are trying to teach them is like, hey, something when you say "ow," that's an emergency response. We want to know what to respond to. But if it's just discomfort, you can use your words, and that's the same. What we see a lot in evangelical spaces or conservative evangelical spaces, that there is that unfamiliarity with discomfort, and then we start calling it, oh no, you're attacking me,
Mm.
or you're invalidating me. No, you're just feeling uncomfortable, and that's fine. Yeah.
I've I've learned a lot. Ironically, this preceded my understanding of queer issues, but in deconstructing and starting to, I don't know if you've read the book by Brian McLaren, Faith After Doubt,
Yeah.
where you
Yeah.
move from simplicity, duality to complexity, then mystery, and being okay with not really having a solid answer to things, to
Oof.
finally harmony. And, I'm certainly at least in that third stage, if not the beginnings of the fourth, but it kind of
Yeah.
all flows together after a while where you're like, I don't need this to be simple anymore.
Exactly.
But boy, that's taken a lot of soul
Yeah.
searching, hard work to get there.
Oh, absolutely. It certainly feels safe, right? To just have an answer. It's much easier to just have an answer. Living in ambiguity
Hmm.
may feel uncomfortable for a little bit, but I agree with McLaren. Harmony is just around the corner. Yeah.
Yeah. And the hard part I think is that those of us who were raised evangelical, we kind of intuitively know from our upbringing, I should say, that
Mhm.
if we don't get it right, we're going to hell.
Yeah.
So there's a really high pressure there to get it right because if we don't, we have to figure out all the rules, what the boundaries of that space are, what the doctrine
Yes.
and dogma have to be to get to heaven when we die. So
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
tend to be very exclusionary. We look at the world from a walled garden perspective of these people are in, these are out.
Yeah, yeah,
Reading the book about centered set church was eye-opening. The idea that we don't have to build walls to keep people in or out. We can focus on Jesus, and if they're moving in the right direction, that's fine. But to get there, you have to release that idea of if I don't get it perfectly right, I'm not going to have things go well for me.
oh, yeah.
So,
That's very confining. Yeah,
and it's, for someone who was raised on eternal conscious torment and hell and the devil and all these concepts of so focused on behavior modification so that we end up in heaven, it's very, very hard to step away from that duality. And I think that stepping in that direction, that's why so many people that deconstruct end up okay with LGBTQ issues,
yeah.
because that willingness to just live with the fuzziness expands, I guess.
Yes, yes, exactly.
So I do want to get back to this thing about theology, because we're kind
Mm-hmm.
of already there, but you were talking about intersectional theology. But I did want to get your take, I guess, on the idea of queer theology. So because I was raised so evangelical, we were taught there's only one gospel, and not really realizing that when we were saying, well, then there's the black gospel, and then there's the Asian gospel, and then we were kind of saying, well, ours is the gospel, and those are bad derivatives of it. But
Yes.
certainly queer theology is its own thing in a lot of places. But that's one thing I just haven't dug into yet because I've kind of been a little scared of it because what am I going to have someone tell me I have to believe? You
Yeah.
know, I know better than to really be afraid of it, but I'm interested what you know about that because you've been in that space for longer than I have.
Yeah, no, queer theology is fascinating. I mean, I'm an intersectional theologian, so there's definitely differences between us, but I love the approach of queer theology. I think the main difference is that there's more overlap than there's different. Let me clarify this first. But the main difference is that queer theology is an approach to hermeneutics, to how we interpret scripture and how it can speak to us queer people. So we're calling that querying the Bible.
Okay,
So
yeah.
that has fascinating effects to stories. Like we just did a Bible study live with Transmission Ministry Collective last week, and we were talking about the blind born man in John. And if you just read the text, it's already fascinating enough, right? There's a lot of things happening there, but it's a great example of a different approach between intersectional theology and queer theology, and both of them have super interesting outcomes. So, a queer theologian may look at that passage and say, "Wow, that guy that was blind was healed." But we forget this part that he never saw Jesus, but everybody's asking him, "Who healed you?" And this guy's like, "I've been blind my whole life. I did not see the guy who healed me because he asked me to wash my face because he just spat in the mud and covered me with mud," right? And then people start saying, "No, you're not the guy. No, you're not the guy." And in queer theology, that's a beautiful thing, not a beautiful thing, but there's like recognition there because trans people, queer people are constantly also being challenged. No, no, Mish, you're not a woman, you're a man. No, you're not homosexual, you're straight, you're just sinning or you're listening to your emotions. So in queer theology, you rephrase those stories and you start querying it and seeing, okay, what's going on here? In this case, that came out of the conversation, but it could be a lot of things. It doesn't have to pertain to people's identities. It just has to find the queerness in it, and in the literal sense of queerness, like the weirdness of God, because how preposterous is it that if the gospel is true, that God sets up this entire world stage for his son to die? That's a pretty preposterous
Yeah.
situation. It's a very queer thing to do. As a queer theologian would say. And then an intersectional theologian would say, okay, the blind poor man is great and interesting because in this story, people ask Jesus, did he sin, and who sinned? Why is he blind? And Jesus says, no, it has nothing to do with sin. You cannot have sin right? That was that old idea of thinking that people had sin and did not commit the sin. But if you take a couple of pages back, you can see that Jesus was under the impression that something had to do with sin because he heals someone and says, "Go and sin no more." So an intersectional theologian likes to look at that and say, okay, um, Jesus grew.
Hmm.
Jesus had that. Jesus had that damaging thought because humanity of Christ. So Jesus is fully human, so probably also full of biases, and was like, "Oh, please go and sin no more." And then later we see the growth arc in there, and that's where you can see it because the people that are being healed are all marginalized people. And this is not new. This is not unique to intersectional theologians. Womanist theologians do that too. But I'm not a black woman, so I cannot be a womanist theologian. So, but yes, it's a similar approach to amplifying people with marginalized multiple layers of marginalized identities.
Okay.
And I would definitely encourage anybody to try to queer the text and see what's weird about this text. What can we learn about this? What feels queer about this text? And it's a very liberating journey. I can tell that. It's amazing.
It sounds like at the core, it's stepping back from our assumptions about the text.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
What
Yeah.
one of the things that I've learned in the last few years, or have really found of value, is getting away from this idea. Well, two ideas. One is univocality, where every single word in the Bible has to agree with every other single word. So the idea of Jesus learning and growing is certainly a not a thing that a conservative would ever be willing to accept.
Yeah.
But also inerrancy, where we have to assume that all the stories are absolutely perfectly true and correct. And both of those both of those hermeneutics tend to force you into a certain way of looking at a story that
Right.
probably is way more complex. And so I think what you're saying makes sense to me, of being able to just step back from it and lay down all my assumptions.
Yeah.
One of the books that I read about 2 years ago now was Misreading the Bible Through Individualist Eyes. And the idea that we Westerners that live in America or Australia or Britain typically have very individual ways of looking at the world. And so we interpret stories a certain way with a certain paradigm that a person who lives in the Middle East does not now, and in Jesus' time would not have understood the same way, simply because
Yeah.
it's a different paradigm. So can I willingly set aside my paradigms and look at what the text is saying from someone else's view? So
Yes.
that kind of makes sense to me, what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think I can apply that. I'll start studying this area because it's fascinating. But
Yeah. Yeah.
I've never heard of
Especially
intersectional theology before, so I'm going to have to do a little research on that.
it's new. It's new. So because not Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw is worked with the term intersectionality a lot.
Hmm.
Womanist theologians obviously have looked at the aspect of like, yeah, we can focus on women in scripture, but that's not enough. Some women were women of color. Some of them had multiple layers, right? So that's what womanist theology does excellent. Again, no comments on that at all. But intersectional theology, I think Grace Jisung Kim is the first person that actually wrote a book about it, and I would assume that she also doesn't claim to be the inventor of it. It's just like a culmination of a lot of theologies where we're really trying to reset our minds and drop our assumptions. Exactly like you said earlier, drop our assumptions. Like Dr. Angela Parker is a womanist theologian, and I heard her speak a month ago, and she did something similar. For example, she's like talking about the Matthew 15 encounter uh, with a woman, uh, and like some translations call it a Canaanite woman, but what's important that it's an other. It's
Hmm.
some. It's an it's a woman who is also marginalized. She's not just a woman, but she is begging Jesus to heal her, and Jesus literally ignores her. Right?
Compares her to a dog, if I remember.
Exactly. Yeah, it gets worse because finally, after Jesus talks to her, he's like, I'm not, uh, it's wrong to feed the dogs. It is so rude. And then ultimately, there's some back and forth, and Jesus seemed to see the errors of his ways. Again, not comfortable. People are typically not comfortable with saying, maybe Jesus grew. Maybe Jesus found out, that was pretty rude. No, you're right. I'm here for everyone. Because again, if we believe in the doctrine of the humanity of Christ, we also have to say that no cheating, Jesus. You can't use your divine powers to be inclusive to all. No, you have biases. You probably poop. Probably. He pooped, right?
So he had to mature through things he learned. I mean, certainly we know that
Exactly.
there's a verse to that exact effect that he, he matured during his life. So
Yes, yes. And
interesting.
it's beautiful to think about that instead of, pardon the pun, viewing every word as gospel. it is it is much more it's much more insightful to view these growth arcs and see how others have been treated by the dominant culture.
Mhm.
And it was not good. It didn't look good.
No.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of humility on our part to be willing to see and accept those things at face
Yeah.
value. And a
Yeah.
lot of the reading I've done, getting away from inerrancy, uh,
Yeah.
moving towards this idea of mystery and being willing to sit with an uncomfortable text and not feel like I have to fit it into some shoebox has really helped.
Exactly. Yeah,
I,
we don't have to do that.
yeah,
That's great.
I, I guess I have two more questions. I'm kind of curious about how you've held on to your faith in this journey because certainly you've been up against a lot of people telling you that you're not Christian or variations on that, I'm sure. What has kept you grounded and connected to God through this, and what does that look like for you now?
Yeah. I've always been a little bit weird in that I have a lot of love for people. What I mean to say with is that even if somebody is a hardcore Donald Trump voter and yells that things like trans insanity and social contagion, that person still, in essence, wants to be seen and belong.
Hmm.
So I'm not going to do the same to them. They want to be seen and belong, and it is my utmost conviction that the moment that we take away someone's sense of belonging, we oppress.
Hmm.
And this is, I have lots of opponents in this field because, this progressive field where we are very comfortable calling people out on oppressive behavior, I want to make sure that we're not doing the same
Yeah.
to conservative kin. And I call them kin because they're my kin. And I may disagree with them fundamentally, but they still want to be seen, they still want to belong, and I'm not going to take away their belonging. I'm not going to oppress them. So that is definitely at the bottom. My worldview is very, very much non-alienation. So whenever people yell things, I like to assume that it comes from that place. That they want to belong with something. They're yelling what the group is yelling. But ultimately, if I sit down with them and they get to know me, that I'm a person and not just a meme on the internet,
Yeah.
that the entire dynamic changes. Yeah.
And so, where does that take you with God?
Yeah, I realized I didn't actually answer that question.
No, I don't know if you said
I
that. It's useful anyway. But
Yeah, Christians hateful behavior is not taking away my love for God. Uh I am weird anyway because I'm Jewish, right? And so I have that interfaith household here where we have a relationship with Jesus, but I'm also Jewish, and this is very confusing to many people. But I I have such a hardcore encounter with God when I gave my life to God in 2011. And it was not at a concert, a Carrie Job concert or so. It was not in an arena, at a festival, or at an altar call at a church. It was by myself, alone in my room.
Hmm.
And it was so extreme. I made a podcast. My first episode of Deep Resonance, or back then it was called The Models We Live By, is literally this story. It was so intense that I just never doubted
Ah,
my faith. I have downs. Let's be real there. I have very deep valleys where I don't feel God at all. But I always kept believing, and I always come back to firmly believing that Jesus' presence is the comfort of my soul. Yeah.
I've been, as you deconstruct, I tend to explain my journey as reconstruct,
Yeah.
because I don't want people to have the impression that for me it's been I'm just walking away from the faith, because although I have a whole lot of things that don't look anything like they did 3 years ago, my my awareness of God as God and someone that is I've been connected to and remain connected to doesn't change. And so it's just a matter of sorting out the details. But
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess for me, a topic that we don't have time to talk about is this idea of universal reconciliation and having a deep and abiding faith that the Lord is okay with us in the mess,
Ah,
no matter what the mess looks like. And
yeah.
even if we die in the mess, God isn't going to give up. And so I can relax. And it's fascinating to me that the entire nation of God's original chosen people is named after someone who is named wrestles with God, Israel, you
Yeah.
know. And I think God's okay with that wrestling process and will always be okay with it. So I feel liberty to go through this D/reconstruction process and not worry about my soul, which always gives me
That's right.
space to turn back to God and say, okay, I'm done fussing at you now. Can we, carry on here? So,
Yeah. I like that. Let's go. Let's go.
so there's so many more things I'd love to talk to you about. I've taken a lot of your time tonight, and I've had a wonderful time, and it was just what I was hoping. Maybe we can reconnect again sometime, but I'm so thankful for the opportunity that you gave me here.
Absolutely.
Anything you want to wrap up with?
No, thanks for inviting me and yeah, elevating voices. I always appreciate it when people come to me. I think Zach sent you my way. Was that it? So, Zach, if you're listening to this, thanks for elevating voices of marginalized people. I am always game for showing people that I'm just a human being. I'm more scared of you than you're of me.
I love your vibe, and that's one reason I immediately wanted to talk to you, is because that just exudes out of you. And even in your solo podcasts and Instagram reels, it was obvious that that was a unique character trait of yours. So I'm so thankful to have discovered it. So
Nice.
thank you very
Thanks.
much, and hopefully we have another chance to talk.
That's right. I'm sure we'll cross paths.
Okay,